the heart monitor flatlined. The chief of surgery laughed it off, calling the bleeding John Doe just another street casualty not worth his time. He ignored the ER nurse's frantic warnings. He had no idea the vagrant bleeding out on table 3 was about to summon the United States military. Rain hammered against the reinforced glass of Cascade Regional Trauma Center like fistfuls of gravel. It was a torrential Pacific Northwest storm, the kind that turned Interstate 90 into a demolition derby. Inside the emergency room, the fluorescent lights hummed a sterile, indifferent tune over the absolute chaos unfolding below. Abigail Hayes wiped a streak of sweat from her forehead with the back of her forearm. After 12 years as a lead trauma nurse, she navigated the organized insanity of the ER with a calm, methodical grace. She knew the smells of a busy Friday night, the metallic tang of blood, the sharp bite of iodine, and the heavy panicked sweat of the injured. The double doors of the ambulance bay blew open. 2 paramedics rushed in completely drenched, pushing a gurney that left a thick trail of muddy water and crimson droplets across the linoleum. "Motor vehicle collision," the lead paramedic shouted over the din. John Doe, found ejected from a pulverized pickup truck down an embankment. GCS is a 7. Blood pressure is 80/50, heart rate 140. He's hypovolemic, breathing is shallow, and he's unresponsive. Abigail was at the gurney before it even locked into place in Trauma Bay 3. She grabbed trauma shears and began slicing through the man's sodden, heavy canvas jacket. "Let's get him on the monitors, push a liter of saline wide open," Abigail directed the junior nurses. As the layers of ruined clothing peeled away, Abigail paused. The man on the table looked like he had been living entirely off the grid. He had a thick, matted beard, dirt caked deep into his pores, and his clothes smelled faintly of diesel-wet earth and something metallic. To the untrained eye, he looked like one of the city's many unhoused men who had tragically wandered into traffic. But Abigail's eyes were trained. As she cleared his chest to place the ECG leads, she noticed the topography of his skin. It wasn't the skin of a vagrant. It was a roadmap of extreme trauma and elite survival. Silver jagged scars crisscrossed his rib shrapnel marks. There was a perfectly healed circular puckering on his left shoulder, a high-caliber gunshot wound. And on his right, pectoral faded, but unmistakable beneath the grime, was a distinct, heavily stylized tattoo of a winged dagger. Before she could process the implications, the curtains to Trauma Bay 3 were violently yanked back. Dr. Harrison Vane stepped into the bay. Vane was the hospital's newly appointed chief of trauma surgery. He was impeccably groomed, sporting custom-tailored scrubs and a platinum watch that cost more than Abigail's annual salary. He had a reputation that preceded him, brilliant Ivy League educated and carrying an ego so massive it barely fit through the hospital doors. To Dr. Vane, patients were divided into 2 categories: those who boosted his prestige and the hospital's donor list, and those who were a waste of his surgical time. Currently, Vane was supposed to be assessing the mass casualty victims from the I-90 pileup. Instead, he had spent the last 40 minutes upstairs personally icing the moderately sprained ankle of an affluent city councilman's son. "What do we have, Hayes?" Vane asked, not bothering to step closer than the foot of the bed. He pulled a fresh espresso from a paper cup, looking visibly annoyed by the mud staining the floor. "John Doe. High-speed ejection." Abigail rattled off rapidly. "His abdomen is rigid board-like. Probable massive internal hemorrhage. His blood pressure is tanking. I need a fast ultrasound stat, and we need to prep an OR. He's bleeding out internally. Vane finally stepped forward, his eyes sweeping over the dirt, the unkempt beard, and the torn canvas boots. His expression curled into a sneer of profound disgust. "A vagrant," Vane said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Probably high on meth, wandered onto the highway and caused this entire pileup. Look at his pupils, Hayes. Pinpoint. He was given fentanyl in the field by the paramedics for the pain." Abigail shot back, her jaw tightening. "That's why his pupils are constricted. Dr. Vane, look at his abdomen. The bruising around the umbilicus Cullen sign. He has ruptured something major." Vane checked his watch, sighing theatrically. "I have 3 patients with premium insurance waiting in the East Wing who actually contribute to society. Give this guy 2 units of O-negative, push some broad-spectrum antibiotics, and park him in Bay 8 until he stabilizes. If he makes it to morning, the residents can stitch him up." Abigail stared at him, stunned. Bay 8 was the overflow corner. It was a glorified storage closet where stable patients were left to wait. Sending a crashing trauma patient, there was a death sentence. "Dr. Vane, if you walk out of this bay, he will die in less than an hour," Abigail stated, her voice dropping to a dangerous icy register. "He needs surgical intervention, now." Vane's eyes narrowed. He stepped into Abigail's personal space, using his height to intimidate her. "Listen to me, Nurse Hayes. I make the triage calls here. I am the chief of trauma. You wipe down the beds and hang the IV bags. Do not ever presume to tell me how to prioritize my operating room. Park him in Bay 8. That is an order." Vane turned on his heel and marched out of the bay, the curtain swaying violently in his wake. Abigail stood frozen for a fraction of a second, her hands balling into fists. She looked down at the John Doe. His breathing was becoming a ragged, wet gurgle. As she leaned in to check his airway, the man's eyes suddenly snapped open. They were a piercing, terrifyingly lucid gray. A bloodied hand shot out with the speed of a striking snake, gripping Abigail's wrist with bone-crushing force. He pulled her down toward his face. Blood bubbled at the corner of his lips. "Viper!" The man rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "Viper. Actual, compromised. Beacon." His eyes rolled back, and the monitor above his bed began to shriek as his heart rate skyrocketed, compensating for the rapid loss of blood pressure. He was crashing. Abigail didn't hesitate. "Forget Bay 8, she yelled to the floor nurse, a young man named Toby who looked terrified. "Keep him here, squeeze those blood bags, give him pressure." She grabbed the portable ultrasound machine herself, dragging it to the bedside. Slathering cold gel over the man's bruised abdomen, she pressed the probe down. The screen lit up with static, then resolved into a grainy black and white image. Dark pooling shapes filled the screen around his liver and spleen. "Massive hemoperitoneum," she muttered. She moved the probe up to his chest. Her heart sank. "No lung sliding on the right side. Toby, he's developing a tension pneumothorax. His right lung has collapsed and the pressure is crushing his heart. Page Dr. Vane again. Code blue override." Toby hammered the paging button. Dr. Vane is not responding. He put his pager on Do Not Disturb while consulting with the VIP. The alarms in the bay grew to a frantic, continuous wail. The John Doe's oxygen saturation plummeted 85-80-72. His lips were turning a dark cyanotic blue. His trachea was visibly shifting to the left side of his throat, pushed by the massive buildup of trapped air in his chest cavity. If the pressure wasn't relieved in the next 60 seconds, his heart would stop completely. "Screw it!" Abigail hissed. She ripped open a sterile drawer and pulled out a massive 14-gauge angiocatheter needle. It was 3 inches long and thick as a stirring straw. "Abby, you can't," Toby warned, his eyes wide. "That's a surgical procedure if Vane catches you. If I don't, he's dead in 1 minute." Abigail snapped, swabbing the John Doe's chest with iodine in a furious circular motion. She located the second intercostal space right at the mid-clavicular line. She didn't have time to second guess. She didn't have time to worry about her medical license or her pension. She was a healer, and the man beneath her was dying. She drove the heavy needle straight down into his chest. There was a loud, distinct hiss, like a tire violently blowing out, as the trapped pressurized air escaped from the chest cavity. Almost instantly, the man's chest fell into a normal rhythm. The hideous wailing of the heart monitor slowed the numbers, stabilizing as the crushing pressure on his heart was released. His oxygen saturation began to climb back into the 90s. Abigail let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, taping the needle securely in place to maintain the airway. "What in the hell do you think you are doing?" The voice cracked like a whip. Dr. Harrison Vane stood at the entrance of the bay, his face purple with rage. He had finally responded to the code blue page likely to complain about the noise. He stormed into the room, pointing a trembling finger at the needle protruding from the patient's chest. "Did you just perform a thoracostomy, nurse? You arrogantly bypassed protocol, practiced medicine without a medical license, and performed an invasive procedure on a dying vagrant. I saved his life." Abigail stood tall, refusing to shrink back. "He was in cardiac tamponade from a tension pneumo. You weren't answering your pages. You are finished." "Hayes," Vane screamed, spit flying from his lips. "You are completely done. I am suspending you effective immediately. I will have your license revoked by the state board by Monday morning. Get your things and get out of my trauma center." Abigail felt a cold drop in her stomach, but she didn't look away. "He still needs surgery, Dr. Vane. He has internal bleeding." "I don't care if he's bleeding gold. Get out," Vane roared. He turned to Toby. "Pull the lines. We are moving this garbage to Bay 8 to die. I will not waste an OR on a transient while we have tax-paying citizens waiting." Abigail slowly backed away from the table, her hands trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and fury. As she moved to the counter to collect her stethoscope, she accidentally brushed against the plastic evidence bag where the paramedics had unceremoniously dumped the John Doe's ruined clothing and personal effects. The bag tipped over, spilling its contents onto the counter, a heavy pile of muddy canvas, a broken watch, and something else. It was a device. It looked like a heavy reinforced brick of black polymer and steel completely undamaged by the crash. It didn't look like any commercial cell phone Abigail had ever seen. It lacked a screen featuring only a series of heavy toggles, a keypad, and a recessed shielded button at the top. And that button was currently flashing a brilliant rhythmic red. Blink, blink, blink. Abigail remembered the man's rasping words. Viper actual. Compromised. Beacon. "What is that?" Toby whispered, leaning over. "I don't know," Abigail said softly. She reached out and touched the heavy device. On the side, barely visible in the matte black metal, was a serial number and a crest, the seal of the Department of Defense. Suddenly, the overhead paging system in the emergency room crackled with a burst of heavy static, completely drowning out the ambient noise of the hospital. It wasn't the usual soft chime of the hospital operator. It sounded like an override. Then, every single desk phone, wall phone, and cellular device connected to the hospital's internal Wi-Fi rang simultaneously. The cacophony was deafening. Nurses dropped clipboards. Doctors froze in the hallways. At the main nursing station, the charge nurse, an unflappable veteran named Maria, picked up the red emergency phone, a direct line reserved only for disaster coordination with the governor's office. It hadn't rung in 5 years. Abigail watched through the glass windows of the bay as Maria answered it. Maria's face drained of all color within 3 seconds. She nodded robotically, her hand shaking, as she hung up the receiver. Maria hit the all-call button on the PA system. Her voice trembled as it echoed through the entire hospital. "Attention all personnel, this is not a drill. By order of the United States Department of Defense, Cascade Regional Trauma Center is now under immediate federal lockdown. No one enters. No one leaves. I repeat," Dr. Vane scoffed, looking around in utter bewilderment. "What is this joke, the Department of Defense? We're a civilian hospital." He didn't get to finish his rant. Beneath the howling wind of the storm outside, a new sound began to build. It was a deep, rhythmic thudding that seemed to vibrate up through the linoleum floor, rattling the stainless steel surgical trays and making the saline bags sway violently on their IV poles. Whoomp, 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 whoomp. It was heavy military-grade rotor wash. Abigail looked toward the frosted windows of the ambulance bay. Through the driving rain, 3 massive matte black silhouettes descended from the stormy sky, their searchlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of predatory beasts. They weren't medevac choppers. They were MH-60M Black Hawks. And they were landing directly in the hospital's parking lot, crushing parked cars beneath their skids as they touched down. The sheer acoustic force of the military helicopters shattered the glass of the automatic sliding doors. A violent gust of jet fuel ozone and freezing rain swept through the emergency room lobby, scattering medical charts and toppling heavy stainless steel IV poles as if they were made of fragile glass. Before the terrified hospital staff could even muster a scream, the chaotic night was torn completely apart by the blinding, strobing glare of tactical weapon flashlights. Heavily armed soldiers swarmed into the lobby. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, clad in unmarked matte black combat gear, their suppressed assault rifles raised and sweeping the corners. These were not local police officers or state troopers. These were Tier 1 operators, the elite invisible ghosts of the United States Joint Special Operations Command. "Secure the perimeter block. All exits. Nobody moves, nobody speaks," a booming voice commanded through a tactical helmet speaker. Dozens of laser sights painted the walls, sweeping over the terrified faces of the medical staff. Nurses dove behind the main reception desk. Security guards immediately dropped their radios, raising their hands in absolute surrender. The entire Cascade Regional Trauma Center had been captured in less than 30 seconds. Striding through the shattered entrance came a man who radiated absolute authority. He wore a damp combat uniform devoid of rank insignia, but his demeanor demanded instant compliance. This was General Sullivan, commander of a classified Black Ops division that didn't officially exist on any government ledger. His eyes scanned the room, cold and calculating, until they locked onto the flashing red light of the emergency beacon resting on the counter of Trauma Bay 3. "Dr. Harrison," his face flushed with a mixture of immense indignation and total disbelief, stepped forward, straightening his custom-tailored scrubs. He was completely oblivious to the lethal danger in the room. "What is the meaning of this?" Harrison bellowed, his voice cracking slightly as he marched toward General Sullivan. "This is a private civilian hospital. You cannot simply crash your military helicopters into our parking lot and storm my emergency room with firearms. I am the chief of trauma surgery, and I demand you leave this facility immediately before I call the governor." Two heavily armored operators instantly stepped in front of Harrison, bringing their rifles to bear the barrels, stopping mere inches from his chest. Harrison froze, his arrogant bravado evaporating into cold, paralyzing terror. General Sullivan didn't even blink. He completely ignored the sputtering doctor stepping around him as if he were nothing more than a minor puddle on the floor. Sullivan marched directly into Trauma Bay 3, his eyes falling upon the bloodied, unkempt man lying unconscious on the gurney. "Status!" Sullivan demanded, looking at the monitors. Abigail stepped forward, her hands still stained with the John Doe's blood. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady under the intense scrutiny of the imposing military commander. Patient suffered severe blunt force trauma from a high-speed vehicle ejection. Abigail reported professionally falling back on her years of clinical training. Massive internal hemorrhage in the abdominal cavity. He developed a tension pneumothorax. I performed a needle decompression to relieve the pressure on his heart. He requires immediate surgical intervention, or he will expire. Sullivan looked down at the massive 14-gauge angiocatheter needle protruding from the patient's chest. He knew exactly what that procedure entailed, and how dangerous it was to perform under such chaotic conditions. Harrison, sensing an opportunity to reassert his shattered authority and deflect blame, quickly pushed his way past the operators, pointing a trembling finger directly at Abigail. "She is a rogue nurse," Harrison shouted frantically. "She performed an unauthorized, highly invasive surgical procedure without a medical license, and without my direct permission, I ordered her to move this vagrant to the overflow bay. But she completely bypassed standard hospital protocol. I've already suspended her, and she will be facing severe criminal charges for this malpractice." General Sullivan slowly turned his head, locking his icy gaze onto Harrison. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You ordered her to move him to an overflow bay," Sullivan asked, his voice dangerously soft, a stark contrast to the roaring storm outside. "Yes," Harrison insisted, puffing out his chest. "He is an unidentified, uninsured transient. We have a mass casualty incident on the highway, and I have highly important VIP patients upstairs who require my immediate attention. I make the triage decisions in this hospital, not some insubordinate floor nurse." Sullivan took one step toward Harrison. The sheer physical presence of the general made the arrogant surgeon shrink back in profound fear. "That vagrant, as you so casually call him, is Captain William Bradley," Sullivan stated, his voice echoing loudly in the silent emergency room. "He is a Tier 1 counterterrorism operative. He has spent the last 3 years deeply undercover, tracking a highly organized syndicate, dealing in stolen military-grade explosives. The intelligence he is currently carrying in his head is the only thing standing between this city and a catastrophic terrorist attack." Harrison's face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. His jaw slackened, and his mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. Sullivan turned his attention back to Abigail, his stern expression softening just a fraction. Nurse, you recognized the tension pneumothorax and bypassed a direct order from a superior to save a dying man's life. Is that correct? Yes, sir, Abigail said, firmly, keeping her chin high. It was the only medical option left. He was seconds away from total cardiac arrest. You have remarkable instincts, nurse, Sullivan said, a hint of deep respect in his tone. He then looked at Harrison with absolute disgust. As for you, doctor, your gross negligence and repulsive elitism almost cost the United States government one of its finest assets. Operator, remove this pathetic excuse for a physician from my sight. Wait, you can't do this, Harrison shrieked, as two operators grabbed his arms, lifting him entirely off the floor. I am the chief of surgery. You have no jurisdiction here. Under the Patriot Act and immediate federal emergency protocols, I command this entire facility, Sullivan retorted coldly. Take him to a holding room and keep him under armed guard. If he speaks another word, zip tie his mouth. As Harrison was dragged kicking and screaming down the hallway, the hospital doors opened again. A highly specialized military medical team rushed in, wheeling enormous black Pelican cases filled with state-of-the-art surgical equipment. Leading them was Major Reed, a seasoned combat trauma surgeon who had operated in the most dangerous war zones on the planet. Major Reed, the captain, is bleeding internally, Sullivan briefed him rapidly. We need an operating room immediately. Reed looked at the hospital's chaotic state and then turned to Abigail. Nurse, my scrub tech was delayed at the extraction point. You know this facility, and you clearly know how to handle severe combat trauma under extreme pressure. I need you in the OR with me right now. Are you ready? Abigail didn't hesitate for a single second. Follow me, she commanded, leading the military team toward the surgical wing. The operating room was a blindingly bright sanctuary of intense, focused action. Abigail scrubbed in with meticulous speed, donning the sterile gown and gloves. She stood across the operating table from Major Reed, the two of them moving in a synchronized dance of life and death. The massive JSOC operators stood guard outside the OR doors, ensuring absolute perimeter security. Scalpel, Reed demanded, extending his hand. Abigail slapped the instrument firmly into his palm. Vitals are holding steady, but his blood pressure is still hovering dangerously low, she reported, keeping her eyes glued to the monitors. Pushing another unit of whole blood, he sustained massive blunt force trauma to the lower abdomen. Reed explained as he quickly opened the abdominal cavity, suctioning out thick pools of dark blood to locate the source of the hemorrhage. Captain Bradley wasn't just in an accident. Our drone surveillance feed caught the entire incident. He was intentionally run down by a heavy SUV while attempting to intercept the cartel's local financial contact. Abigail handed him the cauterizing tool. They tried to assassinate him. Exactly, Reed said, his hands moving with incredible lightning-fast precision as he clamped a severely ruptured splenic artery. The local contact was supposed to deliver the final payment for the stolen explosives tonight. Bradley cornered him on the highway embankment. The target panicked, floored his vehicle, and intentionally struck Bradley before crashing his own SUV into the ravine. As the grueling, highly complex surgery stretched on for 2 agonizing hours, Abigail proved herself to be an invaluable asset. She anticipated Reed's every single need, handing him instruments before he even had to ask for them, managing the massive blood transfusions and keeping the surgical field perfectly clear. Together, they repaired the ruptured spleen, stitched a severe laceration on his liver, and stabilized the crushed ribs, closing the peritoneum. Reed finally announced, letting out a long, exhausted sigh of immense relief. His vitals are stabilizing. Heart rate is returning to a normal rhythm. You did an outstanding job, Nurse Hayes. If you hadn't decompressed his chest down in the ER, he never would have made it to this table. Thank you, Major, Abigail replied, stepping back as the military medics moved in to prep the captain for immediate transport. Outside the OR, the hospital remained locked down in eerie, tense silence. Abigail walked out into the hallway, pulling off her surgical mask and taking a deep, shuddering breath. General Sullivan was waiting for her, his arms crossed over his chest. "The captain is stable, General," Abigail reported. "He will survive." "Good," Sullivan nodded sharply. "We are airlifting him to a secure military medical facility immediately. But before we depart, there is one final piece of business to attend to in this hospital." Sullivan gestured for Abigail to follow him. They walked briskly toward the East Wing, the luxury VIP suites that Dr. Harrison had been so desperately concerned about earlier in the night. As they approached the high-end suite, Abigail saw 4 JSOC operators standing outside the door. Inside the room, sitting on a plush leather reclining chair with an ice pack resting on his moderately sprained ankle, was Preston, the wealthy city councilman's son. He was angrily yelling at a terrified junior nurse about the lack of room service. "Do you know who my father is?" Preston screamed, throwing a plastic water cup at the wall. "I want Dr. Harrison back in here right now." General Sullivan stepped into the room, his towering presence instantly silencing the arrogant young man. "Preston Miller," Sullivan said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You are the local financial contact for the Reyes cartel. We have the drone footage of you intentionally running down a federal operative on Interstate 90 tonight in your customized SUV." Preston's face went completely white. His arrogant demeanor shattered instantly, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. No, you don't understand. It was an accident. I didn't mean to hit him. He stepped out in front of me." "Save it for the federal tribunal at Guantanamo," Sullivan said coldly. "You are being detained under the National Defense Authorization Act for domestic terrorism and the attempted murder of a United States military officer." Operators bag him. The soldiers moved in ruthlessly. They didn't care about his sprained ankle. They yanked Preston out of the luxury chair, slamming him against the wall and securing his wrists behind his back with heavy plastic flex cuffs. They threw a black canvas hood over his head and dragged him out of the room, his muffled screams echoing down the pristine hallway. Abigail watched in stunned silence as the pieces finally clicked together. Dr. Harrison had abandoned a dying national hero to provide luxury concierge medical service to the very terrorist who had tried to kill him. Later that morning, as the sun finally began to peek through the breaking storm clouds, the 3 Black Hawk helicopters lifted off from the ruined parking lot, their heavy rotors beating a triumphant rhythm against the dawn sky. The federal lockdown was lifted and the hospital slowly returned to its normal chaotic rhythm. But the landscape had permanently shifted. Dr. Harrison was escorted out of the hospital in handcuffs by federal agents. He was formally charged with medical negligence, gross malpractice, and federal obstruction. His medical license was permanently revoked, his career utterly destroyed in a single devastating night of pure arrogance. Abigail stood at the nursing station, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, feeling the immense weight of the long night settling into her bones. The hospital administrator, a stern woman who rarely smiled, approached the desk. She looked at the destroyed lobby, the muddy floors, and then at Abigail. The board of directors held an emergency meeting this morning, the administrator said quietly. Effective immediately, you are being promoted to the position of Chief Director of Emergency Nursing. The military also left a highly classified commendation for your personnel file. General Sullivan made it extremely clear that this hospital owes its continued existence to your actions tonight. Abigail looked out the window at the empty parking lot, a small, tired smile touching her lips. She had simply done her job. She had looked past the dirt, the grime, and the arrogant orders of a superior, choosing instead to see the human life fighting to survive underneath. And in doing so, she had saved a hero. If this real-life medical drama kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more intense, true-to-life stories of unsung heroes, shocking twists, and incredible survival against all odds. Your support helps us bring more thrilling content every week. Drop a comment below on what you thought of Abigail's brave move, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update